What's up guys, it's DoubleZug. This is going to be a ZONOZZ heroic boss guide. Despite this boss being one of the first, optional second or third bosses in the raid, I think this one is actually a pretty difficult boss on heroic, and I think if you're more like a casual guild that isn't going for all the kills on heroic week 1, this is one you might want to skip in favor of progressing on the easier bosses, like more Chalk, Hagara, etc. This boss has a pretty tight DPS check as well as a very, very significant HPS check in the ad sections of the fight, as well as having some decent requirements for good positioning and stuff like that, which might take you a few pulls to perfect. And in 25 man it is decently comp restrictive if you want to do the meta strategy of soaking bounces with immunities and mages and stuff like that. So before we go into healing tips and specific nitty-gritty stuff, let's go over the main mechanics of the fight. There are quite a few, so just, buckle in. It's gonna be a little bit longer of a guide here. The first section of the fight has 3 main mechanics. One is gonna be a frontal. This just does resistible shadow damage to the main tank, as well as healing for 10x the amount it does. So keep in mind as a tank, any DR you do is gonna reduce the healing the boss takes, as well as if you do have to readjust the boss for ball bounces or anything like that, just make sure you aren't turning it towards the raid when it does its frontal, or you will just basically wipe. The second mechanic is called Disrupting Shadows. This is just a random AoE dot that the boss will spread out on the raid every once in a while. In 10 man, you will have to dispel this. 25 man, especially if you're doing the single group soaking with immunities, you can just allow this to stay on the raid and heal through it, especially given the fact you're going to have 6 or 7 healers, and there's not that much damage in the first section of the fight, so it's quite easy to just out throughput this damage over time effect. Keep in mind on heroic that when you dispel it, it will knock up players in a radius, so you just have those players run out of the raid and dispel them. The third mechanic, which is the most important and complicated mechanic, is going to be the bouncing ball. The boss will spawn this orb within the first few seconds of the fight directly in front of it, so you will want to have the boss turned around towards the raid for the first few seconds despite its frontal attack. The way that Blizzard intended us to deal with this mechanic is by splitting the raid into 2 separate groups so that you will have enough players to soak the ball damage on both sides of the bounce. And this is how you're going to be doing it on 10 man. However, in 25 man, we're going to be cheesing this a little bit by using immunities, things like dispersion, cauterize, etc., to allow a single player to soak one side of the bounce. However, if you don't have enough of these immunity effects or cauterizes in the raid, you can do the Blizzard intended traditional strategy of splitting up your 25 man into 2 groups. And especially as we get a little bit more gear over the weeks, this strategy will not be too much of a downgrade from the cheesing immunity strategy. So if you have to do that, don't worry about it too much. For the entire duration that the ball is out bouncing around, the boss will gain a stacking and rage effect that's 20% damage done and 5% attack speed increase. This doesn't depend on the number of bounces the ball does, so you can't delay the boss getting more stacks by causing the bounces to take longer by having your soakers super far out or something. It's just based on time. This effect does ramp up pretty significantly, so you will want to have your tank save defensive cooldowns for later in the section, as he won't be taking that much damage at the beginning, as well as the fact that the ball bounce damage does ramp up as well, so your damage taken is going to increase over the course of this phase. The last thing that the ball does is the more times it bounces, it will apply a stronger and stronger damage taken debuff to the boss whenever you do end the phase, and you end the phase by allowing the ball to strike the boss, which will cause him to transition, drop his enrage stacks completely, so those enrage stacks don't ramp up throughout the entire fight, just through each bounce phase, and he will summon a bunch of ads and do a bunch of raid damage. One thing to keep in mind with this ball bouncing is that sometimes the angle of the ball's bounce can be off a little bit, so your tank and soakers are going to have to be a little bit heads up, keeping an eye on that ball. It can be worth to have one person in the raid stack be the rudder, steering the raid around to where they're going to have to be, although the AoE on the ball is quite large, so you don't have to be pixel stacked in order to get the full soak effect. It's also important to remember that the ball has an arming time. You can kind of see it on the model of the ball, where if it's more translucent, that means it can't be bounced yet. And so if you have your bouncers too close to the boss, you can potentially have the orb be phased out as it's going into the stack, phase in too close to the boss, so you can accidentally phase the boss. So just be careful of that. If you do have a bounce that's a little bit too close, the tank just has to drag the boss a little bit further away in order to prevent that from happening. So that's the first section. Now let's talk about the ad section. Once you allow the orb to hit the boss, it will apply that damage taken debuff, as well as refreshing any previous damage taken debuffs, as well as spawning 1 large tentacle in 10 man and 2 large tentacles in 25 man that are closer to the center of the room and that have to be tanked. So you can either have an off tank do this, you can have a feral and bear form, or potentially even just a tanky melee plate DPS tank the second tentacle, and then the main tank with the boss tank the first tentacle. There's 2 types of tentacle ads. There's small flailers, which need to be killed first. These increase the AoE damage your raid takes quite significantly. And there are eye stalks, which are the bigger ones that will spawn in the center, These cast and are kickable despite not having a cast bar, so make sure you get lots of kicks on these. The AoE damage that the raid takes during this section is very, very, very high, especially in progression gear. So this is a very good time for all kinds of personal defensive CDs, raid defensive CDs, healer cooldowns, etc. And it's very important that depending on what strategy you choose to use for positioning in this section, that you are properly positioned and not out of range of a healer. If you are a DPS and you do choose to like run to Africa to kill a tentacle and you run out of range of a healer, you will die very, very quickly because the raid damage is extremely high. Speaking of positioning, I'm going to go really quickly over how the ads spawn in 10 and 25 man. So in 10 man, you're only going to get one of the claws, so it's going to spawn like in the middle here, and then you're going to get like some of the big stalks and flails spawning around in a arc like this. For 10 man, what I would recommend is as the boss phases, you're obviously going to have your tank on the claw with the boss here. I would just have your whole raid stacked. The highest AoE damage is going to be in the first, 10-15 seconds of the phase. As you kill the tentacles, the AoE damage will go down quite significantly. So in 10 man, what I would do is, I would just stack the whole raid here. I would have like healing cooldown. So this is going to be, him, trank, barrier, AMS, all that kind of stuff, as well as like your tank force set. What this is going to do is it's going to allow your ranged and melee to have range on like these two groups. And then as these die, you can have a couple of players go here to kill this, and the rest of the players go here to kill these. Ideally, you'll have one healer positioned here so that they have range on all these players as well as the tank. And then the other two healers are going to go this way to have range on all these players. Now in 25 man is where it gets a little bit more complicated. You're going to have more ads around the room as well as a second claw. So you're still going to have your main tank taking the claw here, and then you're going to have either an off tank or like a feral in bear form tanking the second claw over here. These claw tentacles are very low kill priority. However, if you have like a combat rogue or something, you can just have them stick by the tank to cleave onto these. And there's a couple of different ways you can deal with this. You can either have like two groups of players spreading out to have range on, one side, and then you can obviously have your healers are going to be split around the room to have range on both the tanks and the DPS players. You can spread your group into more groups. It can have 4 on each corner, do like a quadrant setup. Or you can do the simplest and easiest healing mechanic, but potentially not great for like kill times or whatever, where you can just have the entire raid do the same thing they did on 10 man, stack up, use all your healing CDs, kill the first two groups here, and then move as a death ball all the way around the room, killing things one by one. This is going to make healing significantly easier because the more stacked the raid is, the more efficient all healers are in this expansion. So you're going to be able to take advantage of Holy Radiance, Healing Rain, F-Flow, all that kind of stuff very, very effectively this way. But again, it will reduce the kill time you have on all these ads and increase the amount of time you spend in this phase not doing damage to the boss. However, if you do have a lot of trouble pre-assigning positions for everybody here, people making it to their raid markers, healers being pre-positioned to not lose a bunch of uptime and have people die in the first 10 seconds of the fight where all the damage happens, can always just death ball and roll around the room as a big clump. And this is going to be pretty safe, I think, for a lot of groups, especially as you get more gear and the DPS check becomes less important on the boss. You can always just do this strategy for safety. One more thing to mention here is that the timer on when the ball spawns is just set. So no matter how quickly you kill these tentacle ads, you won't get your next bouncy ball faster. So looking through logs, for 10 minutes seems like you want to do 7 bounces at first and then 5 after that. And for 25, you want to do 9 into 7 to have like the timings line up correctly. So now that we've talked about the basic mechanics of the fight, let's go through healing composition. For a 10 man, you're obviously limited. I would recommend on early progression flexing up to 3 healers here. It's just going to make things a lot easier, and the damage check is not as tight on 10 man. The ideal, 10-man core is going to be Disc Priest, Holy Paladin, and then you're going to want to have like a Resto Shaman or a Resto Druid flex here. I think Resto Druid's a little bit better of a flex than Resto Shaman on 10-man here, but either way, it's just fine. With 3 healers, you're going to have more than enough healing, and with 2 healers, it's going to be very tight. So basically, any combination of 3 healers is just fine here. For 25-man on early progression, I'd recommend 6 healers, although if you do have trouble with the HPS checks, you can go up to 7. However, now that we know we're going to be going in with tank 4 sets, as well as Raid Finder gear, especially like Maw and the healer trinkets. I don't think the HPS checks are going to be as hard to make as on PTR, so keep that in mind. I think 6 is going to be just fine, especially if you do the death ball strategy, which will increase the efficiency of all your healers tremendously by having the raid more stacked, so you can take better advantage of, you know, radiance, healing, rain, stuff like that. The ideal composition for 25 man is going to be Disc Priest, double Holy Paladin as your core. Having 2 beacons is really nice on this fight, as the tanks are going to be split, one on the claw, one on the boss plus the claw, and your Holy Paladins, especially if the raid is more spread out, are going to be doing a lot of DL spamming during the ad section, which is going to do tremendous passive healing on the tanks. Your Disc Priest is going to be really powerful in 10 man to pre-shield and POH up the bouncing groups in the bouncing phase, as well as Barrier being quite strong on the transition. And in 25 man, it's similarly strong. Your Atonement is also going to be magnified by the damage taken buff on the boss. It's not quite as powerful as on fights like Halphus Wormbreaker, where your Atonement's going to be doing just insane healing the whole time, but the increase is quite significant, and you can choose to have the Disc Priest basically solo the tank and any players that stay on the tank to cleave on the claws, basically the whole fight, by just spamming Atonement. However, the boss's hitbox is not super large, so the radius on Atonement isn't that wide, and because the raid is going to be so spread out, don't be afraid to mix in some powered shield, POH if it's possible, palm on the raid, stuff like that, especially if your raid is having trouble with DPS dying. The tanks don't take that much damage during this section relative to the DPS players, so if you have the option to not atonementing to do raid healing, if your raid is dying, is going to have a significant benefit. So we have those 3 healers core. The next 3 healers can pretty much be anything. However, I do think that Holy Priest and Resto Druid are particularly strong on this fight, given their healing profile and the strength of HOTS on this fight, especially if you do have the raid spread out quite far to kill ads. The power of Renew and Rejuve, a Wild Growth, Circle of Healing, as well as Tranquility and him being very, very powerful raid cooldowns, makes these specs very attractive for this particular boss. So I think your ideal comp is going to have 2 of any of Resto Druid or Holy Priest, and then your last healer is going to be 1 Resto Shaman. Because Resto Shaman is quite strong in the rest of the raid as well, with like Spirit Link being pretty strong on some fights and Healing Rain being good across the whole raid, I think a lot of like meta compositions will have 2 Resto Shamans on this progression, which is what Who is doing in this kill video. But I think specifically for this boss, if you do have the option, going up a Druid or a Holy Priest over a Resto Shaman is probably going to be overall better. I think their toolkit is just more suited for this kind of damage. So that's composition. Now I'm going to go through each section of the fight and give some tips on how to heal them effectively. For the bouncing section of the fight, remember that the damage is going to ramp up over the course of the fight, with the orb dealing more damage every time it bounces, as well as the boss getting that stacking and rage mechanic. So the very beginning of this section is going to be a good opportunity, if you're already into the fight, to use like a concentration pot or simply to spin your wheels and do a little bit of regenning. However, if you manage your mana properly, you potentially want to be saving an intellect pot just to have throughput for an ad section where you might not have access to a powerful raid cooldown like Him or Tranquility. The raid's damage taken is going to be quite low relative to your healer count in these sections of the fight, so I would recommend kind of spinning your wheels a little bit and healing in a mana neutral way. You really want to have maximum mana to dump during the ad section of the fight, where the raid damage is going to spike really, really heavily. You want to be able to spam your high throughput spells the entirety of that section of the fight without having to worry too much about mana. Shamans will want to Riptide, Healing Rain on CD, and then pretty much just Telluric Currents into the boss to do some damage as well as keep mana neutral. Druids, you're just going to be Rejuve F-flowing and keeping your life bloom up. Disc Priests, you can kind of just spam Atonement the whole time, especially on 25 man. On 10 man, you should be Prayer of Healing a little bit as well to top the bouncing groups. On Holy Paladin, you can Radiance LOD in a mana neutral way on the group. However, once the tank and rage starts stacking up a little bit more, you can swap to Divine Lighting into the tank and using the holy power you generate through Tower of Radiance to LOD onto the group. Holy Priests are going to be dropping Solace, renewing dot targets, and just, Circle of Healing on cooldown. This is also a very good spot for Prayer of Mending. Both the dots and the explosions are going to keep it bouncing around, so you should be palming on CD on both Disc and Holy Priest for this section of the fight. In terms of externals, your single target tank externals should be saved for the end of the section where the Enrage is highly stacked up, and all your AoE cooldowns like Barrier and Aura Mastery should definitely be saved for the ad section of the fight. So now let's talk about healing the transition in the ad section. So it's going to happen at the same number of bounces every time, so it's pretty easy to predict when you need to transition, and this means that it's going to be really effective for you to preload healing, given that the most dangerous time for The raid in the whole fight is going to be on transition, where you're going to take the maximum amount of raid damage. So for any kind of hot healer, you're going to want to pre-hot, spread out a whole bunch of rejuves on the raid, a whole bunch of renews on the raid. Hpriest can even spread power word shields or pre-shield with POH on the raid. Holy Priests and Resto Shamans, if you are going to use a spreading out strategy with pre-assigned locations for groups of DPS, you can always pre-drop your healing rain or your Holy Word Sanctuary in the position that your DPS are going to move to save globals. I would also recommend that you really yell at your DPS players to save personals and to actually press their personals. Barkskins, IBFs, AMSs, Feints, Cloak of Shadows, Hellstones, all that stuff can dramatically increase your raid survivability and reduce your damage taken overall. Also, if you are spreading out and you have pre-positions assigned, I'd recommend doing what XXUU, which is the resto druid from Who that this POV is from, doing what he does, which is you can see as that Knight's bounce is going out, he's pre-moving to his assigned healer position. This is important because it's going to reduce your downtime and it's going to make it so that you aren't trying to move and heal while the AoE is going out. While that might not be as big of a deal for something like a resto druid where you can rejuve on the move, it's still nice to be able to pre-position, pre-pop your tree form, and then, be able to channel your tranquility in the right spot. Just make sure that you aren't running in front of the boss before it does a frontal and killing yourself and healing the boss at the same time. So as you can see here, Resto Druid on this phase is going to be just wild growth rejuve spamming. You also can desync your tree form and your tranquility. However, stacking them is going to make your tranquility much more powerful. But if you do desync them, you can have a CD for each ad section. On 10-man, it's a good idea, especially if you're trying to 2-heal, to schedule your cooldown. So for example, like a Disc Priest hymn, you can stagger that with your Holy Paladin's Divine Favor Wings, with a Resto Druid's Tranquility, so that each ad section you have at least one big healing cooldown, and a big defensive, like, staggering Barrier with your Aura Mastery. If you send every single healer cooldown and defensive in the first ad section, you might be a little bit dry for the second one. Similar to Resto Druid, your other healers are going to be spamming your highest throughput ability. So for Holy Priest, it's going to be Renew. For Disc Priest, you're going to be either atomenting off the boss or spamming Power Word Shield like Binding Heal. POH if you have like a perfect group positioning, but POH is not going to be super strong in this phase given how the raid is going to be spread out for most strategies. Resto Shaman, you're going to be keeping your rain down and spamming Chain Heal for the most part, and spotting with Greater Healing Wave. For Holy Paladins, if you don't have too many players stacked in your group spread, or you aren't using the Death Ball strategy, Holy Radiance is not going to be super effective for the most part during this section, so you probably are going to be spamming quite a bit of Divine Light, both to spot heal and to keep the tanks alive through Beacon. For Paladin, I would try to desync your Guardian and your Divine Favor. Divine Favor shouldn't be up for each ad section, and Guardian's like a single use, so you can potentially Divine Favor the first ad section, Guardian the second, and then have Divine Favor up for the third. Your wings you can kind of just use on CD, I think, for the most part. This ad transition, particularly the first 10-15 seconds of damage taken, is also an excellent time to use any tank force sets you have from that Raid Finder gear. A well-timed Vamp Blood from a Blood DK, if it's stacked with, 6 healers and a 25-man all spamming hard, doing maximum throughput, can do an enormous amount of healing, as well as the extra HP you get being a decently valuable defensive layer. But this isn't specific to Blood DK, all the tank force sets are all incredibly powerful, and I think well worth taking on this fight specifically. There's also some other ways you can potentially reduce damage from these ads. I've heard rumors that Snake Trap and Army will reduce the damage you take here, either by potentially messing with the Flail's knockback or just being legal targets for some of the targeted AoE. I don't know if that's true, I haven't been able to confirm it on logs, but it's worth just sending your hunters Snake Traps and armies with these ad sections in my opinion, just if it does end up working. Those are my healing tips, and that's the guide. If you did enjoy or gain value from this, send a like and subscribe, all the YouTube stuff. If you have any tech, you can post it in the comments.
Swobu, Zug Zug.